Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time it is yet another tribute video, a wake, so to speak, for the career and the life of another legendary horror director. I am still dealing with this right now, as all of us are. This has been a really rough year so far for horror fans. I look at Tobe Hooper, Wes Craven, John Carpenter, George Romero, Dario Argento, and Clive Barker as the 6 men behind the letters horror. And Hooper's recent passing at the age of 74, he passed away today, there really aren't any words for me to really express how much this sucks, really. It really is a awful feeling. And it's a awfully familiar feeling. And I definitely don't like it. It absolutely sucks. Yeah, I know. He was 74, and nobody's going to live forever. But it just seems like there's some dominoes falling here. And I don't like the direction that this is taking. And like I said in the Romero video, I guess I would be able to be a little bit more at peace with this if there was somebody who could take the reins for some of these legendary directors, but there isn't anybody. James Wan is the closest one I can think of, but he isn't, in my opinion, as consistent as some of these other directors are. And who else is there? Eli Roth? John R. Leonetti, who directed Mortal Kombat Annihilation, one of the shittiest films I've ever seen? It doesn't bode well for the future of horror when you never really had anybody who could be a successor to these guys. You had people like Clive Barker who would come on, or Frank Henenlotter, or some of these other guys, or Stuart Gordon, but who would follow in their footsteps. We really don't have anybody who is on the caliber of Tobe Hooper, or Carpenter, or Wes Craven, or Dario Argento, or any of those directors, which makes this loss hurt even more. And I know he hasn't directed anything since 2013, but Hooper is a director that, in my opinion, has always been underrated. Yes, his films aren't all great, but I could say the same about Romero, and I could say the same about Carpenter, and I could definitely say the same about Craven. Now, Carpenter's the most consistent out of all of them. There's only a couple films that he's done that I don't like at all, or I'm not a fan of. Even something like Memoirs of Invisible Man actually had its moments. Hooper has some films that are admittedly pretty bad, and some of them I haven't seen, actually, so I can't really say that much about them. But I've seen some that were kind of lame, like I'm Dangerous Tonight, and so on. But Hooper also was a talented writer as well as a director. And he also did a lot of TV work, and did some really impressive work for television. So that's one aspect that he has going for him in his career that is a bit overlooked. And he directed one of my all-time favorite films in Poltergeist. Whether or not he directed the whole thing, it doesn't really matter to me. His name is on the credits, and his presence and his particular style can be seen and felt with the film. I mean, when you watch Poltergeist, there are certain moments where you can tell that it's a Tobe Hooper film. And it is, I would say, my favorite film that he's directed, regardless of whether or not he directed the whole thing or not. And that's what's also pretty upsetting about this loss, is now we truly will never know the truth behind who actually directed Poltergeist. Regardless of what John R. Leonetti wants to say, I really don't believe in a guy who was just a DP, or not really a DP, he was just on the set, and a guy who is trying to get a career as a horror director. He doesn't want to piss off Steven Spielberg because he'll have a pretty short career if that's the case. Regardless, I truthfully do feel that Tobe Hooper directed a pretty substantial chunk of Poltergeist. And it seems like he's just not being given enough credit. And seeing John or Leonetti say stuff like, well, Hooper didn't even direct that much at all. Spielberg directed the whole thing for the most part. Hooper was just there as a name so Spielberg could get around the DGAs, the Directors Association rules at the time. That seems like it's a slap in the face to Hooper to me. And I don't know if that's the truth or not, but to me it just doesn't really work for me because of other things, like Hooper threatening to sue Spielberg over Spielberg's name being larger in the Poltergeist trailer, and Steven Spielberg having to apologize to Hooper in Variety magazine, as well as in other newspapers in LA at the time. So there's more to this, and we'll never know. We'll never know the real truth because Hooper is now no longer with us to tell us what actually happened from his point of view. Now, Tobe Hooper, of course, started out his career with the absolute masterpiece of horror in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now, he did some other films before that, I think some short films called Eggshells and The Song is Love that I haven't really seen, but most people point to the first true film he did was Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And what a debut that was. One of the most impressive debuts for a director of all time, easily. That film is still one of the most scariest and disturbing films I've ever seen. It is it isn't really that gory. It's the mood and the atmosphere that's just so foreboding and so intimidating and so absolutely crazy and fucked up and strange and surreal. It is without a doubt one of the best horror films ever made, and one of the most influential horror films ever made. Because you look at a lot of horror films that came out after Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and a lot of them are heavily influenced by Hooper's work in TCM. He followed that up with Eaten Alive, which I actually haven't seen yet. I will actually be reviewing that pretty soon because I have decided that after I get done with this mini marathon of George Romero reviews, I want to do a mini marathon of Tobe Hooper reviews because that's my way of saying goodbye to Tobe. It's my way of showing him respect, paying my respects to Tobe in his career and to the man and to the films that he directed. I do believe that he's an underrated director. There are some films that I didn't like that he did, like Invaders from Mars, but his direction wasn't the problem. It was the writing. It was the tone of the film. And there's other films that he's did that I think are extremely underrated, like Life Force, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which I've already reviewed, so I probably won't do that in this particular marathon, but maybe someday down the road when I get back to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, because other than the first film, which I reviewed fairly recently, I would like to do other reviews of the other films, because it's been a long time since I've done reviews of those. I did reviews of those like years and years ago, and I'd like to redo them sometime. But anyway, he followed up Texas Chainsaw Massacre with Eaten Alive. He also did some television work, of course. In 1979, he did Salem's Lot, which is one of the most impressive and great adaptations of a Stephen King novel, especially one of the best made-for-TV miniseries, at least for me personally. But I'm saving that for a Stephen King marathon, and also it's a pretty lengthy film. It's a miniseries, so I guess I just don't really want to tackle that just yet. And that's one that a lot of people have already talked about, a lot of people praise when it comes to Hooper. I want to focus on some of the films that are not really necessarily put in the same pedestal. They're not put on the same pedestal as Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Salem's Lot. Films like Life Force or The Funhouse, which I thought that was a really good film that he did. I'm looking forward to revisiting that one. So he followed up Eaten Alive with The Funhouse, which is one of his best films to me. I'm looking forward to revisiting that film pretty soon. Then he did Poltergeist, which was a smash hit and my favorite haunted house ghost film of all time. Life Force, which I enjoy. It's not as focused as it could be, but I have a lot of fun with it. The score is fantastic, and Hooper's direction is really solid. Invaders from Mars in 1986, which wasn't really the best film to me. I hated the ending. I didn't really like the shifts in tone. Hunter Carson was a pretty awful actor, even though I think he actually was somewhat related to Tobe. Regardless, the kid can't act. But it had featured some very impressive makeup effects by Stan Winston, and I would say it's an interesting film. There's some interesting stuff in it and some great practical effects, but it's just a fairly unfocused, below average film for me. And it's easily one of the worst films I've seen directed by Tobe, but it's not the worst. I've seen a lot worse than Invaders from Mars. Then the same year, he did the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, which in my opinion is one of the most underrated horror sequels ever. I think it's very underrated. I don't understand why it is so maligned by so many people and so many critics. I don't think it deserves that at all. It's definitely more tongue-in-cheek than the first film, but it ends up working out regardless. And it's the last truly great Texas Chainsaw Massacre sequel, if you ask me. 3 had its moments, but overall it's not even on par with 2 for me. The 4th film is a piece of fucking shit. The Next Generation. The prequels and the remakes and all this, and the upcoming prequel I could care less about. For me, the last truly great, worthwhile Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie was Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 in 1986. Then he did Spontaneous Combustion with Brad Dourif, which is a film I've been curious about for many years, and I've heard bad things about it, but I've heard some good things about it from some people. It's one of those films that it's mainly considered to be a misfire, but there are other people who do like it, regardless of the fact that it's not as good as it could be. I want to see it, so that's one that's definitely on the list for Tobe Hooper reviews. I've been wanting to watch that ever since I saw the trailer for the film on a VHS tape. I think it might have been The Hidden. I could be wrong though, but probably isn't The Hidden, but it's probably some other media home entertainment release that was released through New Line when New Line had bought out media. Then he did Night Terrors in 1993 with Robert Englund. I thought that was an absolute shitfest. I did not like that film at all. I thought it was a misleading movie. It was advertised as a Marquis de Sade film with Robert Englund, and he's barely in the movie. So I'm not revisiting that one for the marathon. Maybe someday down the road, but not for this marathon. I want to focus on films that he's done that either I want to see and haven't seen, or films that I have seen before and enjoyed that I want to talk about in order to really showcase how truly talented of a director Tobe Hooper really was. Same year, 1993, he did Body Bags, which he did a segment in that, which is I think was pretty solid. It's a pretty solid horror anthology. That'll be my last review for the Tobe Hooper Marathon, because I want to do that to lead into a horror anthology mini marathon, which will start with Creepshow and then go on all the way up to XX. Then he did The Mangler in 1995, which I enjoyed quite a bit. I thought it was a fun movie. I think that is a very underrated film, and I'm really looking forward to rewatching and revisiting that movie. He did a film called The Apartment Complex, which I never really heard that much about. It looks like a pretty cheap movie. I don't know. Probably not going to check that one out. Maybe someday down the road. Crocodile. Admittedly kind of curious about it because it's a Tobe Hooper film about a giant crocodile. But I don't know. I'll save that for some creature feature marathon. He did the Toolbox Murders remake in 2004, which I thought was actually quite good. For what it was, I thought it was on par with the original and had some interesting ideas. It wasn't perfect, but I thought it was actually a lot better than it was advertised as. And that was the last film that I saw from him that I thought was legitimately good, because Mortuary I thought was pretty shitty, and I haven't seen Djinn. Mortuary he did in 2006. And the last film he directed was Djinn, which was, I don't know if I said that name correctly, Jinn, It's kind of a foreign film he did in 2013. He also did some more TV work. He directed the last episode of Amazing Stories, Miss Stardust, which had Weird Al Yankovic as an alien, which is crazy, and I can't believe I haven't seen that episode. I need to check that out sometime. I would love to talk about Amazing Stories someday anyway, just to review the entire series. He directed an episode of The Equalizer called No Place Like Home. He did the pilot episode for Freddy's Nightmares, No More Mr. Nice Guy, which was a great prequel to A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Robert Englund was in it and everything, and it is one of the best episodes of the series, and I'd probably say the best episode of the series. In No More Mr. Nice Guy. He directed a film called I'm Dangerous Tonight, which I thought was pretty lame. I didn't think it was that great. I haven't seen it in a long time, though. It has Majin Amick in it, who was in Sleepwalkers. You also have Anthony Perkins, Dee Wallace. The film is inspired by a novella, but it's this plot around a cursed Aztec ceremonial cloak that possesses anyone that wears it. So it's kind of silly, but I don't know. Someday down the road, maybe I'll revisit that one. He directed the first episode of the short-lived paranormal TV series called Haunted Lives: True Ghost Stories. And this one really sounds interesting to me. I love this kind of stuff because I'm a big fan of unsolved mysteries and sightings. And this is right up my alley. Excuse me. He directed the episode called Ghosts Are Us, Legend of Kate Morgan / School Spirits. And this is actually a series, well, at least this particular first episode had a couple producers, a couple writers actually, who were involved with Tales from the Crypt, Al Katz and Gilbert Adler. So I'm definitely curious about checking that out because of the writers, and it's directed by Tobe Hooper, and nice early 90s ghost show, so I love that kind of stuff. Leonard Nimoy narrated the episode. And it's on YouTube, so you can definitely check it out if it sounds interesting to you. That was in 1991. And I'm Dangerous Tonight was in 1990. Freddy's Nightmares was in 88. And Amazing Stories was in 87. Then he did, speaking of Tales from the Crypt, he directed an episode of Tales from the Crypt called Dead Weight from Season 3 in 1991, which is one of my all-time favorite episodes of the show. And I love that episode. It's one of my favorite episodes from that season, featuring great performances by James Remar, as well as John Rhys Davies, and a really fun cameo by Whoopi Goldberg. And Hooper's direction in that is top-notch. He did the episode of Nowhere Man. I've never seen that show. He did Dark Skies, an episode of that. He did an episode of Perversions of Science, the short-lived follow-up to Tales from the Crypt called Panic. I don't think I've seen that one, but I'm definitely curious about it. And I will review that series sometime when I get around to doing, because I'm planning on reviewing the entire series of Tales from the Crypt this October. So, and I want to review Perversions of Science as a kind of a bookend, because I think it's an interesting story, and I personally, in terms of the creation of the series, and I personally feel that it's a show that I don't really necessarily feel is underrated because it's a mixed bag. But it's a show worth talking about because it's interesting to see that HBO had this big plan of having Tales from the Crypt be a big movie franchise, and then have Perversions of Science pick up where the series left off. But that didn't work out because Bordello of Blood was a bomb, and so then they had this show, which is a follow-up to Crypt, which is way too much like Tales from the Crypt and felt like a poor man's version of the show. And it really wasn't that great in terms of the quality, so you had a short-lived follow-up to Tales from the Crypt when you should have just had more Tales from the Crypt. And I'll talk about that later in more detail. But he also did an episode of some show called The Others. He did an episode of Night Visions, which is another horror anthology series in 2002. He directed an episode of Taken. And he also did some Masters of Horror episodes, which were just short mini-movies directed by horror directors. He did Dance of the Dead and The Damned Thing. And apparently, he also directed a music video. He directed the music video for Dancing with Myself by Billy Idol. Of all things, Tobe Hooper directed the music video for Dancing with Myself, which once again shows you how multifaceted and talented he was as a director. Now, that's his career, and that's my tribute to Tobe. All I gotta say is my heart goes out to Tobe's friends and family right now in this moment of need. And like I've said about other directors and other actors who have passed on, this isn't the end. They're going to live on through their films, through their work, and through their fans and and people's memories. These directors will never truly die. They will never truly be dead. Hooper will live on forever through his iconic works, and he will always be, in my opinion, one of the letters in the word horror. And I'd put him on the same pedestal, in the same group as other legendary horror directors like Carpenter and Craven and Romero, because Hooper was every bit as influential as those directors were to the genre and to other people who followed after them in their footsteps. And I hope that there is somebody, a younger director, somebody who was a big fan of Hooper and his work, who will be able to not necessarily replace him, because you'll never replace these legendary horror directors. What we can hope for is that somebody will come up and be on par with them, or at least deliver the same passion, bring the same passion for the genre as directors like Hooper did, and be genuinely, truthfully talented directors like they are. John R. Leonetti is not the next Tobe Hooper. Neither is Eli Roth or any of these other directors. The closest I can think of is, like I said, is maybe James Wan, but that's really about it. And that's really sad. We need, and Hooper's passing really puts things into perspective when it comes to these legendary horror directors. There's going to be a time, folks, when they're all going to be gone. And they're no longer going to be around. And I'm not looking forward to that time, but it's inevitable. It really is. And this really puts into perspective how dire the situation is with the horror genre, where we don't have the directors to come in and take their place, or at least give it their best shot. We don't have anybody like that right now. And that does not bode well for the future of the genre at all, if you ask me. But regardless, rest in peace, Tobe. Thanks for the screams, and thank you for watching. And as always, I will see you guys later. See ya.